Please bear with me at times during this video. I'm suffering with a little bit of a cold, so it may sound a bit nasal at times, but I'll do my very best. I wanted to talk about the potential fight with Andy Lee and Billy Joe Saunders, which will be a big event on Box Nation in 2015. Just to set the scene, Andy Lee, as we know, won the title against Matt Korobov, the WBO Middleweight title, by knockout in the 6th round, I believe. Billy Joe Saunders is the mandatory for the belt. Effectively, Saunders turned down a chance to fight Korobov himself for the big domestic clash with Chris Eubank Jr. The winner of that fight, it was an official final eliminator, and Saunders is Lee's mandatory. I believe Lee's also got a gentleman's agreement, or at least his promotional management teams, whatever, have a gentleman's agreement that he will fight Saunders next. So, should there be the case that he's allowed a voluntary, I think that will be against Billy Joe Saunders anyway. So, it looks like this fight's coming up next. Now, I wanted to talk about this fight in a bit of detail. The first thing I'd say is I've read a long forum discussion on this on the Boxing News 24 forum. I read through about 80 to 100 comments, shall we say, and the distinct impression was Andy Lee. I didn't do a poll myself, but I would guess that at least 3/4 of the people who commented were supporting Andy Lee in the fight and thought that Lee would prove victorious. Main reasons being the level of the level he's operated at, the calibre of opposition, and of course the power. So I wanted to talk that through, wanted to look at both angles. Effectively, it's a fight that I'm not certain on. This isn't like Billy Joe Saunders versus Chris Eubank, where I came out extremely strongly in favour of Billy Joe Saunders and, got in a few arguments online with people who were certain Eubank was going to win. This is a fight I'm slightly more on the fence on. However, I will be picking Billy Joe Saunders again. I want to make that clear. Let me start by saying that with Chris Eubank Jr., I had big reasons for doubting him. And I also didn't warm to him as a character. With Andy Lee, it's very much a different situation. I've been a fan of Andy Lee for a lot longer than I've been a fan of Billy Joe. I like Andy Lee's style. I think he's a great guy. No issue with Andy Lee, no issue with his style, his watchability, no issue with him as a bloke. I think he's a top guy, I think he's a good boxer. But I'm with Billy Joe in this fight, and I'll tell you why. The first thing, and perhaps the most important thing, to steal Richard Dwyer's phrase, I'm a big fan of Dwyer, knockouts cause amnesia. Now, I think that's very, very applicable when it comes to Andy Lee, because Andy Lee can clearly hit. But let us not forget that in his last 2 fights, where he's won by devastating knockout, he was behind markedly on both occasions. He was losing to Matt Korobov, some say 5 rounds to 0, some more generous people say 4 rounds to 1. He was also losing to John Jackson in their fight at light middleweight. Again, similar sort of, I think that was a 5th round KO. He was behind on the cards in that fight as well. He's a guy who, whilst I quite like his style, he isn't the classiest boxer. In my opinion, he's a bit of a slow starter. Real technical boxers, and actually maybe not even, I wouldn't say John Jackson was the most refined technician, but good boxers who come out quickly, can take the early rounds off Andy Lee. He is open defensively for a world title level fighter. He can be hit. It's quite regular to see Lee eating a jab and sometimes catching stronger punishment over the course of a fight. For me, Andy Lee is flawed technically, is flawed defensively, and isn't a quick starter. In my opinion, the reason he's won his last 2 fights are purely for his power. And clearly Andy Lee can hit. I mean, he is a big puncher. However, whilst he is a big puncher, a well above average puncher, I'm still not convinced he's a world level puncher. I mean, if we look at the middleweight division, I would say the likes of Gennady Golovkin, Lemieux, I'd say these guys hit harder than Andy Lee. I wouldn't say Andy Lee was a puncher in their league. Sure, he knocked out Matt Korobov, but Korobov was stopped on his feet. Korobov hadn't been tested at an elite professional level. The most devastating highlight reel knockout is against John Jackson. But let us not forget that Jackson was actually a light middleweight, and that was a fight in a lower weight class. A weight class where Andy Lee, in my opinion, would be better served campaigning at, and Adam Booth, I believe, was planning to get him to fight in that division had it not been for, the Korobov chance becoming available. I don't buy into this, that Adam Booth was just testing the waters to see if there were opportunities at both weights. My opinion is that Andy Lee is a guy with a small frame. He's a guy who could make 154, and they were looking to go down that route. And just by fluke, they're fighting at 160. So clearly Andy Lee does have power. But, as I say, stopping Matt Korobov on his feet, who'd never been truly tested, and knocking out a light middleweight, it doesn't have me running scared of his power. His power is proven, it's there, it is a relevant factor. But I'm not 100% convinced that it's elite level. I mean, let's put it another way. Relatively recently, I don't have the date in front of me, but Andy Lee fought Anthony Fitzgerald in Ireland over 10 rounds. The referee who was judging this fight scored it 98-94 in Andy Lee's favour. In other words, Fitzgerald was given 10 points in 4 rounds, and more importantly, stayed the distance over 10. Now, Fitzgerald is a small middleweight. Another guy who'd be better suited to light middleweight. More importantly, we recently saw, and by recently I mean a month, 2 months ago, Fitzgerald knocked Spark out in 30 seconds by a big middleweight, a genuine middleweight, Spike O'Sullivan. Now, Spike O'Sullivan blasted Fitzgerald out in 30 seconds. Yet Andy Lee went 10 rounds with him in a closest fight. Now, I appreciate that's only one example. It doesn't prove whether Andy Lee is or isn't a huge puncher, or whether Spike O'Sullivan isn't a huge puncher. But let's say it is an interesting piece of form that Fitzgerald, who got knocked out in 30 seconds by Spike, went the distance with Andy Lee. Especially when we consider that Spike, who certainly appears to punch harder than Lee on that form alone, went 12 rounds with Billy Joe Saunders in a fight that Billy Joe pretty much whitewashed Spike. So I appreciate this is a somewhat tenuous link, but Billy Joe went 12 with Spike, was never bothered by Spike's power. Spike knocks out Fitzgerald, right at the beginning of the fight, whereas Fitzgerald gets through 10 rounds with Andy Lee. My point is that, yes, Andy Lee is a power puncher, but for me he's not proven at the top level, and when he fights that better level of opposition, I don't think he's got the power of a Golovkin or a Lemieux. If you're second rate, if you haven't been tested, if you're a light middleweight, he's probably going to knock you out. But I'm not convinced against genuine class middleweights Andy Lee's power is enough just to get him through. Now, Billy Joe Saunders is a tough, durable guy. I'm not convinced Chris Eubank Jr. is that big a puncher, but some of the comments I got on my previous videos, you'd think he was like a cross between, Mike Tyson and Deontay Wilder. I mean, people rate this guy as one of the biggest punchers out there, Eubank Jr. I personally don't think he is that big a puncher for reasons I've gone into and can't be bothered to go into again. But whether you think he's a huge puncher or not, Chris Eubank Jr. is a big middleweight, and he landed multiple shots on Billy Joe Saunders cleanly over the course of their 12-round fight. At no point was Billy Joe dropped. There were times he got tired, there were times he got hurt, but at no point was he dropped. He had the defensive capability to stay on his feet and stay in the fight. Spike O'Sullivan, the guy who in my opinion is possibly a harder puncher than Chris Eubank Jr. As I say, he knocked out Anthony Fitzgerald in a few seconds. But Spike also went the 12-round distance with Billy Joe, was able to land on Billy Joe, but at no point was able to floor Billy Joe and to hurt him. Not only is Billy Joe very tough in terms of his chin and his durability, he's also sort of defensively capable. He rolls with punches. He knows how to position himself. He plays the angles right. For me, Billy Joe's going to be a very, very tough man to knock out. He's just got a lot of ring savvy for a young man, and he's very, very tough. Again, there's chat that Billy Joe's small for a middleweight, but in my opinion, he's not as small as Andy Lee. Billy Joe's never campaigned at light middleweight. So my thought process here is that if Spike O'Sullivan didn't ever put Billy Joe in danger, if the almighty Chris Eubank Jr. never dropped Billy Joe, it's not a safe assumption that Andy Lee's power alone is going to get him through this fight. Yes, Andy Lee has the capability to hurt Billy Joe, but Billy Joe's a slick guy. He's a southpaw. He's got huge amateur pedigree. Don't expect that Andy Lee's going to be able to land one of those hooks or one of those long left hands like he has been against John Jackson or Matt Korobov. I know Korobov's got pedigree as well, but we shouldn't just assume that Billy Joe's going to stand there and take clean punches. He's got defensive capabilities. Now, my other concern for Andy Lee is, as I say, he's prone to losing the early rounds. He's prone to being outboxed by guys with good technical pedigree. Well, in my opinion, this is another strong point for Billy Joe Saunders. We saw how Billy Joe came out against Chris Eubank Jr. When Billy Joe's on his A game, and before he starts to tire, which I'll come on to in a second, he is a very, very skilled, gifted, technical fighter. He starts quickly as well. I mean, the vast majority of YouTube, who I've spoken to, would award Billy Joe the first 5 rounds in the Chris Eubank Jr. fight. And I could honestly see a similar thing happening here. I could see Billy Joe staying at reins, using his jab to work his way in, being defensively sensible, avoiding Lee's long left and his right hook, and sort of using his amateur kind of point scoring background to win the early rounds, just like he did against Chris Eubank Jr. It wouldn't surprise me if this fight actually played out similar to that one, where Lee, who's probably got, certainly has got the edge in power, could come on into the fight. Lee's also a tough man. He's also got experience of going late in fights. I don't think Billy Joe's got the power to get Lee out of there and to hurt Lee. So it wouldn't surprise me if Lee came on strong towards the end of the fight, if Lee's power started to tell then. But as I say, whilst Lee can hit, and he is a more proven puncher than, say, Chris Eubank Jr., I'm not convinced he's a world-class puncher. And I am starting to believe that Billy Joe has a world-class chin. So I don't think that Lee will knock Billy Joe out. And I think with Lee's tendency to start slowly, combined with the fact that Lee can often be outboxed by a superior technician, we could well be in a position where Billy Joe is 5 or 6 rounds up and Lee's playing heavy catch-up before he becomes a factor in the fight. The big concern for Billy Joe Saunders fans is stamina. He was in the shape of his life for that Chris Eubank Jr. fight, but he did seem to ebb away in the later rounds. He seemed to tire. We certainly saw a better Billy Joe in the first half of the fight than the last half. And maybe he is just a low stamina fighter. Maybe he's just built that way, that no matter how hard he trains, no matter how well disciplined he is, he's going to have problems late on in fights. Maybe that will catch him out one day. But I think against Andy Lee, he's going to have enough to get the job done. I think the Saunders jab, the Saunders movement and the Saunders technical background will once again steal the 5 or 6 early rounds. And I think the Saunders toughness and durability will see him through the second half of the fight. I don't think Andy Lee's power is going to be enough. And I think Lee is too defensively open and too susceptible to getting hit with the jab. From Billy Joe's perspective, stamina is the issue. We know he's blown up to 15, 16 stone between fights before. And it may be that, 5-10 years of doing that has taken its toll, and it will require a lot more than one camp to get his stamina to world level. Certainly, if Billy Joe is tired and drained after 8-9 rounds, he doesn't want to be catching heavy shots from Lee. And with Lee's power, there is a chance that Lee could, steal rounds or even knock Billy Joe down. So I'm not saying that I'm 100% convinced on this one. I'm not predicting this with the same conviction as I was when when Billy Joe fought Eubank. Because I think if Saunders does start to tire like he did in that fight, Lee's a finisher, Lee's got power and Lee's got experience. But my pick is Billy Joe. I think he'll win the early rounds. I think he'll outwork Lee, outland Lee, outbox Lee. I think Lee's defence is too open. And I think by the time Lee gets into the fight, it'll be too late. And once again, Billy Joe Saunders' toughness and durability will see him through. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.